Hi everyone, it's Jerry. This is video 25 from the Beginner to Chess Master playlist, which is a progressive series of videos, and I'd like to share with you another group of basic checkmate patterns. If you've been tracking this playlist, you'll know the previous video covered 5 checkmate patterns. I have 9 to share with you in this one, 24 total examples, many of them very quick, covering the double bishop mate, Boden's mate, Balestra, Arabian, corner, Morphys, Pillsbury's, Damianos, Lollis. Don't be too fixated on the names. I said this in the last video. Knowing the names is not nearly as important as knowing what that looks like on board. We want to become familiar with how the pieces interact. I must admit that for me, some of the names, well, that was news to me. Or in other words, I knew what it looked like on board, and only later did I realize, oh, it has a name, and oh, that's what it's called? Okay, great. So I knew what it looked like before knowing that it actually had a name. Anyhow, these examples that I'm going to share with you, I'm pulling from lichess.org/practice. I've included a link in the description if you would like to maybe try these on your own first. With that said, I think we could just go ahead and dive right in. Throughout this video, I'll be adding some tips if I think it'll be beneficial to you, highlighting squares, drawing arrows, anything that I think will help you to better recognize these patterns when you sit down at the board. So, with that said, let's have a look at example 1, covering the double bishop mate. 3 examples highlighting the double bishop mate. White to move in this one, and it's a checkmate in 1. Bishop to d4, and that's mate. What more can I add? All the squares are going to be taken away from the enemy king. There is something I could add here. Bishops that function on adjacent diagonals. You might want to have that register in your mind as having some added value. There's some nice synergy when bishops function on diagonals that are right next to each other, especially when both bishops are pointing at the enemy king. Bishop d4 will do the trick in this one. White to move here. It's another checkmate in 1. And bishop takes bishop here, and all the squares will be taken away from the black king. And one last example highlighting the double bishop mate. Black to move here. This is a checkmate in 2. Bishop covers these two, and yeah, after this move here, queen takes pawn, sacrificing the queen, giving up the queen. Bishop takes bishop is mate. Added value when those bishops are functioning on adjacent diagonals. Moving on now to Boden's mate. This once more involves the 2 bishops, only this time interacting in a crisscross way. Notice the dark square bishop is already taking away a couple important squares from the enemy king, knifing in there. If only we can cover these 2 squares, and we can, it's going to be mate with bishop to a6 for Boden's mate. Bishops functioning in a crisscross way towards the enemy king. Something a bit more practical, middle game type position, black to move. 1 bishop is knifing in. If we could somehow get the bishop safely to a3, that would be mate. The pawn is covering a3, however. The pawn on b2 is covering a3. In fact, here's a term I've yet to cover. The b2 pawn, we can say, is overloaded. He has 1 job too many. 2 jobs in this case. Defend c3 and a3. Queen takes c3. That forces pawn takes. That was with check. And now we could sweep in for Boden's mate. One last example for Boden's mate. Just kind of flipped here, playing on white's end. This bishop knifes in. If we could only get here safely, and we can. In this case, it's the b7 pawn. that is overloaded. Queen sweeping into c6, capturing the pawn with check forces pawn takes queen, and then finally we deliver Boden's mate, that little crisscross pattern towards the enemy king. Okay, only one example now highlighting what's known as the Balestra mate, and this is one of them that was news to me when I was, in the intro to this video. Yeah, this was one of the names. Yeah, that was news to me. I didn't know the name of this one. I was familiar with the pattern, the queen and bishop working together. In other words, bishop to d6 is going to be checkmate. What more can I offer with this one? Well, here's something that I think might be useful to you. When that enemy king is on the edge, and your queen is positioned a knight's move away from that king, take note of what color square that queen is on. Okay, if she's on a light square, she covers all light squares that the king could potentially run away to. It's only the dark squares that are going to be safe for the king. So with that said, guess what piece would complement a queen that is on a light square? Dark square bishop. Of course, the other way to look at it, queen on a dark square, that light square bishop will complement that queen very well. In this case, bishop to d6 will do the trick. A bit of a crisscross type pattern, a bit of a Boden's-like mate in a way. There is some additional squares that the queen is, of course, taking away from the enemy king. Bishop d6 does the trick. Balestra mate. Moving on to Arabian mate. This involves the rook and the knight. A knight, when positioned 2 squares from the corner, is very powerful. So much so that a rook combined with that knight on either g8 or h7, and both are going to be mate. If we could somehow get the rook here or here, it's going to be mate. Of course, the rook doesn't move like this. In this case, rook h7 is mate. Another example of Arabian mate. A little bit more involved. We can first, white to move here, we can first make use of this pawn being in a pin. It is not able to capture. Black king would be in check. We can go to f6. We could go to that post that is 2 squares away from the corner square. And now if only we can pull off a rook g8 move or rook h7 move. That's the final thing that we really want to crash through with. Well, we can do that. Rook takes pawn, pawn takes rook, and there we go. Rook on g8, game over. And on rook takes pawn, knight block, we would simply take the knight. Let's see what black does. Rook takes pawn. Okay, computer went with a knight block, and we simply take the knight for mate, the Arabian mate. One last example highlighting the Arabian mate. In this particular case, the knight isn't going to function 2 squares away from the corner square. We can capture on f7 here, eliminating an important defender of g6. We now make use of that square, forcing an only move, king g8. And now the rook sweeps in for checkmate. Moving on to the highly creative corner mate. Who came up with that one? Anyhow, enemy king is in the corner. He's restricted greatly. As soon as the knight makes a move, the rook will cover these two, and we only have to cover the corner square. Knight f7 will do the trick. Nothing fancy going on here. And one last example for corner mate, playing as black here. We're really close to giving mate. These 2 squares taken away by the black rook. Knight f2 will give check, but the rook is covering that. Well, let's get rid of the defender of f2. We can first sacrifice the queen, and only then deliver this corner mate. Okay, moving on to Morphy's mate. There are 4 examples covering Morphy's mate. This highlights an interaction between rook and bishop, and it's the bishop that usually delivers that final blow. He's the one that's delivering checkmate in this case. A bit of a corner mate for this particular example. Bishop to f6. All right, these two are covered. Bishop to f6 will take away that corner square for mate. Second of 4 examples. This is a checkmate in 2. Rook g4 first, and then bishop delivering mate. Example 3 of 4. Rook g1 check. Computer move, just delaying mate for as long as possible. And now we can crash through here. Rook takes knight, king takes, and then we take here and then go here next for checkmate. Okay. In this case, the king went in the corner. We could take here, and this will lead to checkmate, but we could do things in a much more forceful way. Rook to g8 gives check. There's 2 ways to capture the rook. If rook takes rook, we would then play queen takes f6. The rook would have to block, and then we would take the rook for mate. And the other variation would be after rook g8, king takes rook. This allows the queen to sweep over to function just like a rook. The king would then have to go into the corner, and then bishop takes f6 would be mate. Let's see what option black chooses. Rook takes rook. So now we sweep in on f6 and then capture here. So not really a Morphy's-like mate, but in that other variation it would have turned out to be like a Morphy's mate. One last example highlighting Morphy's mate. Rook and bishop converging on g7, this intersection square g7. That's a check. And if we move the rook, well, wherever we move the rook next, it's going to be check. If we back up, that'll allow black to block with f6. So we should first take out that pawn. We can now return to g7. It's a bit of a windmill tactic, something I covered several videos ago in this playlist. Now that the pawn isn't on f7 anymore, we can drop back to, I believe, any of these squares, and it will be leading to checkmate. So let's just go here. Black could only make a couple blocks. We take with the bishop, and take once more with the bishop for Morphy's mates. 3 more to cover. Pillsbury's mate is next. Once again involving a rook and bishop. The only difference is that it's the rook who's really delivering the final blow. These 2 squares are cut out by the bishop, and we just have to deliver a file check for mate in this case. And one last example for Pillsbury's mate. We can go with a queen sacrifice. Everything is pointing at g7 here. Something has to happen. Queen takes g7. Rook takes g7 check. And now what do? We can, let's see, rook to g8 will be a double check. That's the most forceful check in the game. Forces a king move. So rook to g8 forces king takes rook, and then we would sweep over with the other rook. The queen will have to block, and then we capture the queen for mate. Rook g8 is it. Rook g1, and now rook takes queen. It's the rook who's delivering the mate. The rook and bishop working well together. Damiano's mate. What to add with this one? This involves a pawn or a bishop in close proximity to the enemy king and the most powerful piece around, namely the queen. We can see that a pawn with this kind of depth, pawn this deep into enemy territory, especially when close to the enemy king, supports some nice squares. Queen to h7, that is mate. Example 2 of 3 for Damiano's mate. If we could somehow get our queen to g7, that's going to be mate. The knight is in the way, but we can force him to move. Rook to h8 forces knight takes rook, and now we sweep in right next to the king for Damiano's mate. And one last example, this is a cool one. Team Black. A lot of clearance sacrifices here. What we would really like to have happen is getting the queen to h2. How can we pull this off? Well, we sacrifice the rook, give a check, sacrifice another rook, and now our queen gets to sweep over here to h8 and finally get to h2 for mate. Last checkmate pattern to cover, and that is Lolli's mate. And how to describe this? Well, it involves having a pawn. A pawn. I think maybe in some cases it could even have a bishop controlling. This is the key point. Controlling that fianchetto square. Right when the bishop develops, going to g7, we consider that corner square. Excuse me, one square away from the corner square. This square right here. Controlling that with a pawn, getting the queen involved, that's going to be mate. On g7 in this case, pawn and queen working very well together. Similar case here, white to move. This is a check. And now we go here. Notice the pawn is now controlling that g7 square. Queen now sneaks in. And there's nothing that black can do to stop queen g7 mate next. One final example, our 24th example. Went through these pretty quick. White to move. This is going to take a little bit more work, but a nice finish here. First, we activate the rook and prepare for final flurry of moves, final move sequence, bunch of sacrifices going on. We capture on h7, capture the queen with check, and before I put it on the board, after rook takes queen, king takes rook, we would go to h6. We have the support of the bishop, and then sneak in for mate on g7. Black moves to g8 in this case. This allows rook to h8, something we've already seen with Damiano's mate, a bit of a clearance tactic. Giving a check. Now we get to go to h6 for a check, and now g7 for mate. So there is some added value, of course, to having a pawn so deep in enemy territory. Allows us to pull off Damiano's mate or Lolli's mate in many cases. So those are the only 9 that I wanted to cover in this video. Feel free to leave any feedback to this video, and I will catch you soon enough in video 26. That's all for now. Hope you're having a great day, and I will catch you soon. Take care. Bye.